Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. I know that there are several other philosophical events going on at this same time, so I'm very grateful to those of you who's decided to come to this one. It's nice to have this opportunity of talking about what philosophy can contribute to climate change. I think there's a lot we can contribute, but as yet, not so many philosophers are as involved as could be. So I'm going to start with a well-known clause out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the treaty that was drawn up in 1992, I think it is, and started the process that's still continuing of international cooperation or attempted cooperation to do something about climate change. It is in one way an extraordinarily successful treaty. It's been ratified by 195 states and the EU as well. Interestingly, when I checked on this, I discovered that that's more states than belong to the United Nations. So that's a little bit paradoxical. I don't know quite how that happens. But at any rate, just about every nation on the surface of the earth has agreed to this treaty. That was relatively easy to do because actually the treaty doesn't require them to do very much. What it really does is state an aim. And here is an expression of the aim. This is not the whole of it, but a part of the aim, one of the most important parts of the aim set up by the UNFCCC. It says, the ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that final expression, dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, is one that anybody who has anything to do with climate change soon gets to know by heart. It sort of regulates thinking about climate change. So this formally set up the aim of the treaty, and actually it's really directed the way in which subsequent negotiations have been conducted under the UNFCCC at the various COP meetings which you've all heard about. COP stands for Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC. There have been negotiations now for 25 years, and roughly this is the agenda for these negotiations, and it's sort of set out in Article 2. The first thing is to work out what concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere would be low enough to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that's sort of a job for science more than anybody else, but we'll see, not just for science. Then work out what pattern of annual emissions of greenhouse gas are consistent with maintaining concentration below that level. And finally, allocating those annual emissions among the nations. So that's three parts to the negotiations. And each time they get gone through again, and the targets get altered, and various renegotiations happen. Now, in that agenda, you can ask, what role is there for moral philosophy? Well, I think everybody has thought it pretty obvious from the beginning that there is a role for moral philosophy in the third one of those steps. This is the one for allocating global emissions among nations. It's pretty obvious that that involves issues of fairness and justice. There is a lot of injustice already in climate change itself. The basic transaction of climate change is that rich people and rich countries emit greenhouse gas, which does harm to poor people and poor countries. And that's clearly unjust. And so lots of issues of justice and fairness arise in that third stage of distributing the task of doing something about climate change. For example, this is a hot matter of dispute and always has been. Do the rich countries owe compensation to poor countries for the harm that they have already done them by the greenhouse gas that they've emitted in the past, much of which is still up there in the atmosphere now, continuing to do harm? So there are questions of justice and fairness. I think it's partly because the philosophers who've got involved in climate change have been especially interested in justice and fairness. They're mostly political philosophers, and I'm sure you know that justice is the prime subject of political philosophy. Most of those philosophers have concentrated on that last step. So the first two steps have been left to other people, principally to scientists, to economists, and also to negotiation in the political process. There's not much philosophy being involved in those first two steps. But there ought to be. I think you can see that because you can see they involve value. If you take the mantra, avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, it's got this word dangerous in it. And dangerousness is obviously a matter of value. It's an evaluative term. To judge whether something is dangerous involves doing some valuation. So value, as well as justice, is a component of what we need to think about when we're dealing with climate change. Very broadly, I think we can treat morality, and hence moral philosophy, as divided into two big departments. Justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, doing good. That's to say, promoting value in the world, making a world a better place and saving it from becoming a worse place. And that's an aim of morality. At least as important, I think, as the aim of justice, but it's largely been neglected in the philosophy of climate change. And because of that, I'm going to concentrate on value in this talk. I'm going to neglect justice instead. This needs to be done because, quite apart from the philosophers who are involved, the whole of the United Nations framework, the UNFCCC process, has not given adequate recognition to the need for value theory in its work. And I've got an illustration of that, which is a quotation from the synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2003. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is not actually formally subsidiary to the UNFCCC, but it does do a lot of work on behalf of the UNFCCC, and it's taken on board that aim, the dangerous anthropogenic interference aim, from the UNFCCC. So that's being referred to in this thing from the synthesis report. The synthesis report is a summary report which the IPCC produces of its work every 5, 6, 7 years. So this is what they said in 2003. Natural, technical and social sciences can provide essential information and evidence needed for decisions on what constitutes dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. At the same time, such decisions are value judgments determined through socio-political processes. Now, I think they got one thing right and one thing wrong. They recognized that dangerousness is a matter of value. That's what they say. It's a value judgment. So they recognized that point, at least. But then they went on to say, value judgment determined through socio-political processes. It's as though they thought that because these were a matter of value judgments, there was really nothing intelligent that could be said about them. They just had to leave that to the political process to think out. They evidently had not heard of value theory, which is a part of many disciplines, primarily a part of moral philosophy, which is concerned with value, but also, say, economics. Economics is concerned with value. And decision theory, which is a discipline that comes in between moral philosophy, economics, political theory, some other disciplines. Decision theory is also concerned with value. So there is a lot of intellectual work. There are academic disciplines concerned with value, with how values are connected together, how one should judge values, things of that sort. And the IPCC seemed not to have heard of any of that in 2003. It's got better. This is from the latest synthesis report, the one that came out in 2014. Decision-making about climate change involves valuation and mediation among diverse values and may be aided by the analytic methods of several normative disciplines. Ethics analyzes the different values involved and the relations between them. Recent political philosophy has investigated the question of responsibility for the effects of emissions, and so on, ... So there the IPCC is actually recognizing that there is a real subject and there is academic work to be done in it. I wrote that paragraph, actually. That's why I agree with it. But it still seems to me that scientists have not given enough attention to value theory. And here's an example of that. This is one that I'm ambivalent about, because in one way I like this point that the IPCC made, but as you'll see, I also have reasons for treating it skeptically. So in the latest round, this is what came out at the end of 2014, the scientists on the IPCC, the people who investigate the science of the atmosphere, were putting about the idea of a carbon budget. The carbon budget is how much carbon or carbon dioxide can be emitted into the atmosphere while still not causing destruction, while still, as you might say, being safe. How much can we safely emit? And particularly in the press conferences they were holding after their report was published in Stockholm, they were saying we've got another 1,000 billion further tons of carbon dioxide can be emitted. 1 more trillion, to put it another way, 1 more trillion tons of carbon dioxide constitutes our carbon budget. We can emit that much, but no more. We'll be in trouble if we emit more. That was the message that was coming out. And I think that's a good message. It's very dramatic, because 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide is just 30 years of emissions at the current rate. So if we carry on as we're doing, we've got 30 years before the world gets destroyed, as you might say. And that's a pretty dramatic warning, I think, and worth making. So that's why I like it. It's rhetorically effective. On the other hand, I have to say that the basis of it is really rather flaky. Why do they say 1 trillion tons? Well, it's because they've worked out that if we stay below 1 trillion tons in our budget, we will have a 2/3 probability of keeping climate change below 2 degrees. There are 2 numbers in that, 2/3 for 2/3 probability and 2 degrees for the amount of warming. Where do those numbers come from? Well, 2 degrees is now embedded in a lot of the political process, but actually it comes from almost nowhere. It's been treated as though 2 degrees is the boundary between interference with the climate system that's dangerous and interference that's not dangerous. Somehow, conventionally, 2 degrees has come to be thought of as the appropriate boundary. As you know, that's now challenged, and there are 1.5 degree people, and actually the nations have agreed to stay well below 2 degrees. But 2 degrees remains a sort of standard benchmark. But to be honest, it's got very little basis. It emerged in the course of history, in the history of the debate somehow, and it's become solidified, but there isn't much basis for it. But it is still in the political process, so there's some excuse for the IPCC to use that. But where does that 2/3 probability come from? Why should we be interested in a 2/3 probability? That's not any statistical measure that we're used to. You know, we're used to measuring things in numbers of standard deviations from the mean and things of that sort. There are quite a number of different statistical measures which could have been used. Why should we be interested in 2/3 probability? There isn't any reason, actually. It just was a number that came out of the air. I know how it arose historically, but it's really not a good basis for making decisions. And it illustrates something else about the IPCC, that it's very much concentrated on likelihood. Everything in their report is about what's likely to happen, what's unlikely to happen, what's more likely to happen than not. And likelihood is actually not a good basis for making decisions. This is something that we can learn from value theory, and they need to learn from value theory. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. So that's why I say that the IPCC still has a way to go in order to take on board the importance of the value theory that we can do. We need to do value theory. We wouldn't need to do much if climate change was like a cliff. Here's a picture of a cliff. If this was the way that the problem of climate change was, then we wouldn't have much need for serious value theory. What I've got in this diagram is concentration of greenhouse gas on the horizontal axis, and value. This is sort of the goodness of the world on the vertical axis. So what this picture shows is that as we increase emissions of greenhouse gas, dump more greenhouse gas into the world, things get gradually a bit worse, but then we come to a place where there's a crash and the world is sort of finished. You might imagine that was supposed to be at 2 degrees, shall we say, or the concentration that would lead to 2 degrees. Well, if climate change was like a cliff, you wouldn't have to do much value theory to know how to behave. I mean, what you would have to do is just not go near the cliff. It doesn't take much theory to tell you about that. But as a matter of fact, climate change is not like a cliff. Or it may be like a cliff, but if it is, we don't know where the cliff is. It may be that there's some tipping point, as it's called, which is such that if we go beyond there in the concentration, then everything will go haywire, massive feedback effects will come into play, and we will go all the way to totally disastrous climate change. It might be like that, and in fact it's even possible we've already gone over a cliff in that respect, but we don't know, if there is a cliff, we don't know where it is. So we have to work on the basis of uncertainty, and the best thing we can do is talk about expected value. And here's a picture of expected value against concentration. What's expected value? Well, the way you assess the expected value of some bad event is by calculating how bad it would be, so you need a measure of its badness, and multiplying it by the probability that it's going to occur. So if there's a cliff, you've got a bad event which is total disaster, and you've got to multiply that badness by the probability that it'll occur. And obviously, as you get greater and greater concentration, the probability increases, so the expected value goes down. But it goes down in a steady way as the probability of disaster increases. So in expected value terms, which, as I shall explain in a moment, is how we really need to think about this, we haven't got a cliff. In fact, instead, we've got a steady downward decline in value, expected value, as concentration increase. And that's a situation in which we really do need to have some theory, think about the value of things. You might think, well, we've just got to avoid dangerous climate change. But actually, that's not true, because, or not necessarily true. Just because something is dangerous, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. For example, surgeons conduct dangerous operations. Brain surgeons conduct dangerous operations. They take on a significant risk of killing their patient for the sake of a cure. And that's the right thing to do. So even though it's dangerous, it's the right thing to do. So if we were thinking in terms of dangerousness, it's not we've got to avoid anything dangerous. What we've got to do is avoid a degree of danger that we should not go beyond. That it's a bad thing to go beyond. And once you think about that, I think you should see that dangerousness really isn't the issue anyway. What we've got is some balancing to do. We've got the potential harm, or the expected harm, that can be done by having more and more gas, on the one hand. On the other hand, we've got what it costs to try and reduce the amount of gas in the atmosphere, and those things have to be balanced against each other. What we really need to be thinking of is how bad the effects of climate change will be, and weigh those, which is then something that we can weigh against the cost of doing something about it. So really, the UNFCCC's project should be to keep below the amount of climate change that we should keep below. And that means thinking about what should we keep below, and that's where value theory is needed. The first thing that will come out of that is to realize that the decision-making about climate change should depend on expected values. This is what decision theory tells us. It says that what you should do is maximize expected value. I'm speaking slightly roughly, and there's quite a lot of disagreement in decision theory about the details of this, but roughly, most decision theorists agree that we should try to maximize expected value. We should choose the policy which makes the expectation, the mathematical expectation, which I just described to you, of the results as high as possible. Why? Well, it's not because it's intuitively plausible, though I think it is intuitively plausible. Why that's what we should do is something which is demonstrated by the axiomatic foundations of decision theory. There's an argument, a good argument, not utterly convincing, but nevertheless a worthwhile and quite sustainable argument that says we should maximize expected value on the basis of some pretty satisfactory premises. So it's not just because it's intuitively attractive. We can actually defend this view that we should maximize expected value. But I don't have to bother with that, because actually there's really there are only two things. Well, no, really one thing that I need to get out of it. And that is that the idea of basing your decisions on likelihood is a bad one. You might think, and perhaps the scientists on the IPCC thought, that what you should be aiming to do with respect to climate change is choosing the policy that is most likely to have a good outcome. So trying to maximize the likelihood of a good result. You might think that that's the basis on which you might do policy. But I think you can quickly see that's not right. Aiming for the maximum likelihood of a good result is actually not the right policy, and you can see that by thinking about many examples, but the one I've chosen is why there are lifeboats and why there should be lifeboats on ships. It costs money to put lifeboats on ships, and actually they're not likely to be used. Not many ships sink. Most ships go to their graves with their expensive lifeboats still on board. So if you're looking for what's likely to happen, well, honestly, what's most likely to happen is that the money you spend on a lifeboat is going to be wasted. So if you were looking for to maximize the thing that's, to find the thing that's most likely to do good, then you would not put lifeboats on ships. But obviously you ought to put lifeboats on ships, and that's because there is a small possibility that the ship will sink. It's quite small, but if it happens, that will be such a bad disaster if it doesn't have lifeboats on board that that consideration, the badness of that potential unlikely disaster, is enough to make it worthwhile to have lifeboats on board. The small possibility of a catastrophe is the thing that should dominate our calculations in deciding whether to put lifeboats on board. So something that's very unlikely to happen actually is the most important thing in that question. So we should be looking for expected value. So the aim of decision making about climate change so far as value is concerned involves judging the expected harms of climate change, the expected benefits of doing something about it, and balancing those things against each other. And a question that comes up in the course of doing that is whether climate change, the climate change problem, is like the lifeboat problem. As some economists think, in fact Martin Weitzman, Harvard economist, thinks that what really matters in climate change is the small possibility that it gives of a total catastrophe. He doesn't think a catastrophe is likely, but he thinks it might happen, and he thinks that if it would happen, it would be so bad, if it did happen, it would be so bad that, that its badness should dominate our thinking about climate change. So this, I think, is a worthwhile question when we turn to the philosophy of climate change. We should be thinking, is Weitzman right about that? Is climate change like the lifeboat problem. So that's one of the questions that will come up when we start applying value theory to climate change. I hope it's obvious that doing this, though, is a matter for ethics. Ethics is primarily the subject that deals with value. It's certainly true that we're not going to be able to do everything for climate change ourselves as people who do ethics, moral philosophers, because the problem is so complicated. Climate change is huge, affects everybody in the world, and will go on affecting people for many hundreds of years. And philosophy is not good at dealing with such complexity. Economics is. So economics is quite good at making valuations in very complex problems, but the values the valuations it makes should be founded on proper ethical principles. So that we should have a companionship. We should have moral philosophy delivering the principles and economics applying those principles to the complexity of the problem. In the course of doing that, there's another question that's going to come up. And this is sort of a question that's interesting from a professional point of view rather than from the point of view of the world. But it matters to whether philosophers have been keen to find themselves involved in doing something about climate change. Does climate change raise new problems of valuation which don't come up or don't come up much in other areas of life? If it does, then it will make it particularly interesting to philosophers of value, to investigate this problem, because new problems are always much more interesting than just applications of old solutions. So I should also, in going through the question of valuation of climate change, I shall look for new problems of interest that, that might persuade those of you who are philosophers that there is something worthwhile to do in the philosophy of climate change. I'll do that by looking in areas in questions of climate change which look as if they're most likely to produce specially interesting questions. And those are questions of life and death. There are important questions of life and death that come up with climate change, and it's quite natural to think that these might be ones where really new thinking is required. And actually, I think that's true, as you'll see in a while. Life and death, then. So I'm going to start with death, and I'll come to life in a bit. There's going to be a lot of death caused by climate change. I think you can see sort of obvious ways in which climate change kills people. There's weather. Just the weather directly kills people. Heat waves in particular. The European heat wave of 2003 is said to have killed tens of thousands of people in Europe. Storms are killing people more and more in the world. Droughts, of course, are great killers, and they're caused by the weather. Famines result from droughts, and they kill many people. Also, diseases will spread, particularly tropical diseases. Malaria, for example, which is a great killer, is climbing the mountains of Africa. There are areas of Africa where there used not to be malaria. Now there is malaria. Malaria these days kills something like 600,000 people a year, and it's spreading for that reason. Diseases of diarrhea, diarrheal diseases, they are great killers of babies and young children in particular, kill well over 1 million each year, and those are promoted by greater heat. So there's going to be a lot of killing done by diseases, and then more generally, climate change will increase poverty in many parts of the world, and that will cause malnutrition, and malnutrition can kill people by starvation even. So there's going to be a lot of killing. I've actually got some estimates of numbers here. You shouldn't rely on these numbers very firmly. These are numbers produced by fairly reliable organizations like the World Health Organization, but the methods are not ones that you could trust implicitly. But these are numbers that have come out by various estimates. The World Health Organization, as long ago as 2004, reckoned that climate change in that year killed 141,000 people. and the methods have been outdated by another organization called the Global Humanitarian Forum. They said 300,000 in 2010, and they reckon that certainly by the year 2030 we can expect 500,000 deaths from climate change per year. That seems a plausible sort of figure to fix on. It's an increase of about 1% in the world death rate. Isn't that right? No. Yes, 1% in the world death rate, which is, you know, not something that sounds like a great exaggeration caused by climate change. And it's a lot, and it'll go on for a very long time. There's no end to the killing of climate change that anybody can think of. So this tells you should think of the a number of people who are going to be killed by climate change as in the region of tens of millions. 500,000 per year for many decades at least. In the region of tens of millions at any rate. So that gives you an idea of the sort of numbers that we're talking about. So let's think about, remember I said we could be interested in whether the special problem of climate change is a problem of catastrophe, like the lifeboat case. So let's think about the number of deaths. I've told you that climate change just can be expected to kill tens of millions of people. But suppose that we do actually get a true catastrophe arising from climate change, which is unlikely but possible. And let's take the maximum capacity catastrophe that you could imagine, I would guess, which is that everybody living on Earth gets killed. And suppose this happens when the Earth's population has got as big as 10 billion. Suppose all those people got killed. Let's see if that possibility of catastrophe is something that we should think of as outweighing the ordinary considerations in the way that the possibility of catastrophe outweighs ordinary considerations in the lifeboat case. Well, it's certainly very unlikely that there will be a catastrophe on that scale. Let's pick a number. Let's suppose it has a chance of 1 in 1,000. That's a pretty unlikely chance. So 10 billion people get killed with a probability of 1 in 1,000. What's the expected number of deaths? Well, that turns out to be 10 million people. So the expected number of deaths from a climate catastrophe is 10 million, which is in the region of the number of people that climate change is going to kill anyway. And even if we raise the probability to 1 in 100, it's still only 100 million people, and that's still within the range that we can expect from expected climate change. So this consideration of the badness of death doesn't give us a reason for thinking that climate change is like the lifeboat case. We still will need to put a value on them because there will be a lot of killing done. So if we're to do what I say we should do, which is to value the benefits of doing something about climate change to compare them with the costs, we are going to have to set a value on these lives. And economists have been doing this for a long time. They set a monetary value on lives, but a lot of people think that's horrific. They think that it's really immoral that we should be thinking of people's lives in terms of monetary value. I think that since my time is beginning to get a bit short, I'm not going to dwell on that. We can talk about that in questions afterwards. If you're horrified by the idea of setting a monetary value on life, I think you shouldn't be horrified, actually, and I'll explain why if you ask me later. But to save time for the moment, I'm going to skip on to that. I'm going to get on to the other subject, not death anymore, but life. Let me just say briefly, my conclusion is that the question of valuing life does not raise fundamentally new problems for philosophy. Remember, I'm wondering if there are fundamentally new problems for philosophy. And I think it doesn't raise fundamentally new problems. And I'm going to rush on without trying to justify that fully. So now, life as opposed to death. So this is the other end of life, births. What value do we set on births? So I've been talking about what value we should set on deaths. What value should we set on having people in the world? This is adding people to the population by being born. We obviously should think about that, because climate change is for sure going to affect the population of the world. Such a major change in the way that we live is bound to have effects on the world's population. It may not be even clear whether it's going to increase it or decrease it as things stand at the moment. Demographers, so far as I know, have not come up with a view about that. Demographers, you would think, might be interested in predicting how the effect of climate change is going to influence the size of the world's future population. But they haven't, so far as I know. And it's not clear, naively, what the direction is going to be. You can think of it, causes why it might be greater and causes why it might be less. Here's a cause why it might be greater. Climate change is going to hold up economic development in many of the poor parts of the world. Climate change is really bad for the poor countries. Well, if it holds up development, development is the best contraceptive. Development is what limits the size of the world's population, ultimately. And if development is delayed, then that's going to delay the effect of that contraceptive. So we're going to get a greater population as a result of delaying economic development. That's one cause which will increase population. A cause which will decrease population is perhaps one that you more readily think of. That climate change is going to make the world less habitable. It's going to flood the productive margins of the world. Many countries, productive countries where a lot of food is grown, are within, vertically, only a very short distance of sea level. Much of Bangladesh, for instance, is only about 1 metre on average above sea level. So those countries are going to be flooded. Agriculture is going to be harder in many ways. The world's water supplies will begin to dry up. So it's going to be much harder to live on the Earth. The Earth will have a lower ability to sustain people, and so this is going to produce a downward pressure on population. And in the extreme, we may even get this catastrophe that I've already talked about, which might prevent there being any more people ever. It might cause human extinction, and of course that's just an extreme change of population. It's preventing the very many people who would have existed from ever existing. And if you think about how many people those might be, think about how many human beings there might be if we don't go extinct over the next 100,000 years, say. And those people will not exist if climate change causes extinction. That's a huge number of people lost. The expected value of that is in the billions, not in the region of tens of millions. So that possibility of the extinction of human beings, preventing all those future people, is something which might potentially, just because it's such a big effect, make climate change like the lifeboat. If that's bad, it's going to be really bad because it's so many people involved. We might think that that's a reason for doing everything for doing what we can to control climate change. So we really need to think about the value of population, what I said, birth. The problem is that in policy making, this is never done, or hardly ever. There are cases of policies which are deliberately aimed at controlling population. So China has what's called a pronatalist policy, an antinatalist policy to reduce Chinese population. Germany has a pronatalist policy to increase the population. So there are deliberate population policies, certainly. But the population implications of other policies are almost universally ignored. Just about anything, any policy change you might make will have an effect on future population. Any change in the rate of tax, for example, is going to cause people to decide to have children at a different date, will affect the way that people move around, who gets to meet whom, and so on. So changes in ordinary fiscal policy will expect to affect population. When people judge those, do they ever think about the effect of population? No, they don't. Or what about a policy which actually is generally evaluated by cost-benefit analysis in most countries? Policy of making roads safer. when governments judge how much money they should spend on making roads safer, they do put into their calculations the saving of the lives that the people that there already are, but they ignore the fact that if you make lives safer, you get more people, because some of the people that are saved by having safer roads are young people who will later have children. Those are people who would never otherwise have existed, and they will have children who would never otherwise have existed. So saving the lives of young people increases the world's population. Does that get put into the calculations? No, it never does. They never think about that. And similarly with climate change. Policymakers on climate change have never thought about this. And I think this is what I call the elephant in the room of climate change. If you're not used to this English expression, an elephant in the room is a really big and important thing that's in the room, but everyone ignores it. They don't talk about it. They turn their backs on it. Well, that's what population, the value of population is in climate change. Why? Why is it so often ignored? Well, I think it's because many people, and I have to say this includes me on an intuitive level, have something that I call the intuition of neutrality, which is nicely expressed in a sentence that I take from the philosopher Jan Narveson, published long ago. Narveson says, "We're in favour of making people happy, but neutral about making happy people." So what he's thinking about is, what do we value in the world? What do we care about promoting in the world? Well, if we're moral people, we care about making people better off, making them happier, as you might say. But generally, intuitively, we don't care about having more people in the world, even if those people would be happy. So we don't care about increasing the happiness of the world by the means of just adding people to the world. We don't care about that. What we care about is taking the people we've got and making them better off. So I think many of us have that intuition. We think that adding people to the world is in itself neutral, or even reducing the number of people in the world. If a couple, for instance, could have had a baby but decides not to, so they cause there to be fewer people in the world than there otherwise would have been, we don't think that that's a moral bad. We think that's morally neutral. So the intuition is that adding an extra person to the world, this is sort of refined, to the intuition is that adding an extra person to the world is morally neutral, neither better nor worse than not adding her. There are exceptions. I think we mostly think that if somebody's added to the population and her life will be really bad, she will live a life in constant pain, say, it's a bad thing that this person should live. And some people, I think that if you could create a person and her life would be superb, it would be a good thing to create her. But what we think is that there's a range of levels of well-being that people might have, such that if an extra person is added to the world and her well-being will be within that range, then adding her is neither better nor worse than not adding her. I've got that written down here. I'll read this out. This is the formalization of the intuition of neutrality, as I called it. Some range of levels of well-being, which I call the neutral range, such that if two worlds are the same, by which I mean they contain the same people, and all of them are equally as well off in one as they are in the other, except that one person exists in one world who does not exist in the other, then so long as that person's well-being is within the neutral range, neither world is better than the other. That's a formal statement of what I've just been calling the intuition of neutrality. And I think intuitively, most of us think that. We think creating a person is in itself neither a good thing nor a bad thing. And that may well be why policymakers ignore it when they're doing their policy. They think this is ethically neutral, so they don't have to think about the value of this. They think it's neutral. However, they're wrong. This intuition, I'm not going to say it's false. Part of it's false, but I'm not going to say it's all false. Part of it's false, but even insofar as it's not false, insofar as it's true, it does not justify ignoring the effect of policies on population. I think this is one concrete discovery. There's been quite a lot of philosophy about the ethics of population in the last few decades. Not much concrete agreement has emerged from that. But I think we can say that this is something that we have discovered, really, that you shouldn't ignore the elephant in the room, that really the intuition that adding people is ethically neutral really can't be defended in the end. I'm going to try and justify that. I think I'm only going to be able to do about half of the justification, I'm afraid, because of time. But I'm going to begin explaining to you why this intuition is not going to do the job. So this is the way the argument's going to go. I'm going to, first of all, state for you a strong version of the intuition, and then I'm going to show that that strong version of it is false. That's the beginning of the job. The second thing that I'm not going to have time for, unless you ask me to in questions, is to say that even the part that may yet be true does not justify ignoring changes in population. That's the second part that I think I probably won't have time for. But still, we'll see how it goes. Yeah, I probably won't. But here comes the first part of it anyway. So the first thing is to state this strong version of the intuition of neutrality. This is the same statement as I had up before, except that the last clause is different. In the last statement of the ordinary intuition, which I now call the weak intuition, the last clause was, neither of the two worlds is better than the other. In this strong version, that clause is, the two worlds are equally as good. Now that's a stronger claim. If you say of two things, neither is better than the other, that leaves open the possibility of what we call incommensurateness. It leaves open the possibility that although neither is better than the other, they're not equally good too. And intuitively, this can quite often happen. If you have two things which are very different in their nature, you might think, well, because they represent different values, we couldn't reckon that this one is better than this, and nor could we reckon that this one is better than this. But the idea of saying that actually they're equally good, that's very strong, and we wouldn't want to say that. So that's why this is a strong version. This is one that says that actually, if you add a person, that's equally as good as not adding her, and that's stronger than what I said first. And this is definitely false. And here comes the demonstration. Here, first of all, we've got some pictures. Now, this is just a picture of the strong version of the intuition, and I have another picture like this in a moment. What this picture does is give two possible worlds. It's got a picture of one way the world might be over here, and another way the world might be over here. And they've got different numbers of people in them. This one's got 4 people, this one's got 5 people. And on the vertical axis, going up vertically, I'm using the vertical axis to show you how well off the people are. So the higher up they are, the better off the people are. So there's this man here who's quite well off, and this unfortunate woman who isn't very well off. So the difference between these is that the 4 people who exist in both, they're in exactly the same position. They're all level on the right with what they were on the left. But we've got an extra person here, this woman over here, who's been added, and she's in what I call the neutral range. Her life is not really good and it's not really bad, and the intuition is that B there, which has got the person in, is equally as good as A. So that's just a picture of the strong intuition. Now comes a picture that shows you why it's false. This is the same picture so far as A and B is concerned, but I've added another possible world, which is C, over there on the right. So what does the intuition tell us about these things? Well, I've already said it tells us that A and B are equally good. That's what I just said with the last diagram. What about C? Well, it tells us that A and C are equally good too, because in C, this last person is within the neutral range. And the strong intuition is that if you add a person within the neutral range, that's equally as good as not adding her. So C is equally as good as A, and I've already said that B is equally as good as A, from which it follows that B and C are equally good. B is equally as good as C, and C is equally as good as B. But that's plainly false. Because if you compare B and C, you'll say they've got the same population. This woman here is the same person on C as she is in B. They've got the same population, 5, and 4 of those people are exactly as well off in B as they are in C. They're not better off, they're not worse off, they're equally as well off. But the woman is better off in B than she is in C. So B is better for one person, and it's worse for nobody. It's equally as good for everybody else. Therefore, plainly B is better than C. But I just said the intuition of neutrality implies that B and C are equally good. Therefore, the intuition of neutrality is false. We have to reject it. So that proves what I said I'd prove. And now I'll just wind up with the conclusions. I can't do the same thing with the weak intuition. That requires further argument, which I haven't time to do. That's the argument there, which we can come back to it. But this is the conclusion. Philosophical arguments show that it's wrong to ignore the elephant in the room. The problem is, we don't know in philosophy how to do it right. We know you can do it wrong, but after several decades of work in philosophical ethics, we've not come to a conclusion about how we should value changes in population. So we're in a bad state, practically, because we need to make decisions about climate change now. And I just said, this is the elephant in the room of climate change. This is something that really matters for climate change decision-making, but we don't know how to do it. So we're forced to make decisions at the moment in a position where we don't know the proper basis for making the decisions. Now, that's a difficult problem, but philosophy never gives up. This is a problem for philosophy. How should you make decisions when you don't know the correct basis of making decisions? This is a question that's come into philosophy really with only the last 15, 20 years. It's these days called the problem of moral uncertainty. What to do when you're uncertain what is the moral basis of the decisions that you make? And philosophy is working on that too. So there are things for philosophy to do to try and solve the problem of population ethics, and in the interim, while it hasn't managed to do that, to think about how we should make decisions in a context where we don't know the proper basis for making decisions. So we've got a new problem for moral philosophy. We've got interesting things to do, and that's where I'm going to wind up.